Christmas morning in 1945 in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia should have been a happy occasion. Children waking early to tear away wrapping paper off of gifts, laughter, and the sounds of new toys, huddled by the fire on a cold, snowy day, enjoying the company of family. Unfortunately for the Sodder family, fire would not bring them comfort. It would burn away what they cherished most and change the course of their lives forever, leaving everything they knew in cinders. Around 1:30 a.m., after the Sodder house had fallen silent and all 9 children and 2 parents had gone to bed, a blaze broke out. The fire quickly spread and overtook the house, which eventually collapsed in on itself, leaving only charred remains of the place they had once called home. The fire department did not arrive on scene until 8 a.m. that morning, 6.5 hours after the fire had started. They found George Sodder, along with his wife Jennie, and only 4 of their children standing outside. Their home was gone, and the other 5 children were nowhere to be seen. Maurice, age 14, Martha, age 12, Louis, age 9, Jennie, age 8, and Betty, age 5, all gone up in smoke. But for the Sodders, this wouldn't be as simple as grieving and burying the children and trying to keep their memory alive. Instead, Christmas would forever serve as a reminder of the day that sparked the seemingly never-ending search for answers. Fayetteville, West Virginia was a small, quiet town in the 1940s, but despite its size, there was an active community of Italian immigrants amongst its residents. Many within this circle considered the Sodders to be a respectable middle-class family. The patriarch of the family, George Sodder, had been born in Italy as Giorgio Sodder. He had immigrated alone to the United States as a young adult and settled in West Virginia, where he would meet Jennie Cipriani. The two quickly fell in love. They married and settled in Fayetteville to start a family. The Sodders would go on to have a total of 10 children, with their eldest joining the army and moving away from home. However, while George Sodder was well respected among his peers, he had strong negative opinions about Mussolini, the leader of the National Fascist Party in Italy, and he was never hesitant or quiet about these opinions. Before George's trucking company took off, he'd been employed by a man named Fiorenzo Genutolo, who strongly disagreed with George's views of Mussolini. Despite their differences, though, after George's departure from Fiorenzo's company, the two remained close friends, or so it seemed. At the time George left his friend's business, he had a $1,500 mortgage insurance clause that was payable to Mr. Fiorenzo Genutolo. Allegedly, Fiorenzo increased the value of the note to $1,750 without the Sodders' knowledge or permission, and he received all $1,750 in the payout. But it seemed this was still not enough money for Fiorenzo. According to the fire marshal's report, just 60 days before the fire, Fiorenzo attempted to trick George into signing an additional life insurance policy on top of the insurance he already had. Things didn't go quite as planned, however, when George and Jennie refused to sign for new insurance. Fiorenzo, angered, went to the Sodders and threatened them, saying, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed, and you will pay for the dirty remarks you have made about Mussolini." But this wasn't the only strange occurrence that took place prior to the fire. About 1 month before Fiorenzo's threats, a stranger had approached George at his home inquiring about hauling work. The man, however, lingered near the back of the house when he spotted the 2 fuse boxes located there, and he said that they would cause a fire someday. This particular statement struck George as odd at the time, as the power company had recently checked the electrical wiring and declared it in fine condition. Strange, yes, but the statement wasn't alarming. That was until the flames began. The last Christmas Eve the Sodders would have as a whole family was one filled with warmth and anticipation for the morning to come. Each of the children had already opened a single present from their eldest sister Marion, age 17. Despite the children's excitement, though, George and Jennie Sodder were tired and began dozing off around 10:30 p.m. The children were still very much awake and begged their parents to stay up later. George and Jennie relented, but under one condition. The children were to do their chores, feed the cow, and check the chicken coop outside before they went to bed. The children agreed, excited at the prospect of staying up later than their parents. But it wasn't long until they too grew sleepy and went to bed after fulfilling their promise. But the silence was disturbed at 12:30 by the sound of the phone ringing from the kitchen. Jennie Sodder was the one to get up from bed and answer the phone. On the other end, she heard a female ask to speak with someone Jennie was unfamiliar with. In the background, there was raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses being toasted. Jennie told the woman that she must have the wrong number before hanging up. Jennie looked around the living room to see all of the lights on and Marion asleep on the sofa. From the silence, Jennie assumed her children had already done their chores and were asleep in their rooms upstairs. So she closed the curtains, locked the door, and shut off the lights before returning to her bed. Just as Jennie was beginning to drift off, she heard a loud thud from the roof, which was followed by a rolling sound. She closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but only minutes passed until she smelled something odd. Sitting up in bed, Jennie was horrified to see smoke pouring into the bedroom. She quickly woke George and grabbed 2-year-old Sylvia from her crib, all while screaming for her other children to get out of the house. Along with Marion, the 4 Sodders fled the home through their front door, still yelling for the others. Moments later, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr. rushed out of the house from their upstairs bedroom, their hair singed. As the Sodders continued to yell for the others, the moments ticked by at an agonizingly slow pace. They waited, but it was a beat too long, and as the horror set in, George sprang into action. The flames had spread to the front door, so George broke a downstairs window and attempted to climb through, slicing his arm open on the glass. He quickly realized that crawling through a window would be of no use, as the flames had already spread to the first floor and over the staircase leading up to the children's bedroom. George then remembered a ladder he always kept propped up on the side of the house, but when he went to grab it, the ladder was mysteriously absent from its normal space. Running out of options, George had the idea to pull one of his large coal trucks up to the side of the house, climb on top, and access the children's bedroom window this way. But, to his dismay, neither truck would start even though they had been in perfect working condition the day before. Growing increasingly desperate, George tried scooping water out of a nearby rain barrel, only to find the liquid frozen solid. George joined the rest of the family, crying out for the children, but not once did they hear a single voice respond. While George attempted to re-enter the home, Marion ran to a neighbor's to call Fayetteville's volunteer fire department, but there were no operators responding. A neighbor who saw the blaze drove to the local tavern to find Fire Chief F.J. Morris and to warn him of the blaze. Morris started what was known as a phone tree system where one firefighter phones another, and so on. But Morris did not leave for the site of the fire immediately, as he was unable to drive the fire truck and said he had to wait until one of the other men showed up. As time passed, more and more townspeople saw the blaze, and soon everyone knew there were children trapped inside. When the department finally arrived on scene, it was morning, but it was too late. The house had collapsed into the basement, the Sodders' life lost among the still burning ashes. Investigators began searching the blackened remains of the house, which had still been so hot upon their arrival that they were forced to cool the entire site before beginning. The Sodders left the ruins to stay at a neighbor's house while investigators attempted to recover remains and determine the cause of the fire. But only 2 hours passed before Fire Chief Morris arrived at the neighbor's doorstep. He informed the Sodders that state police traced the cause of the fire to faulty wiring at the back of the house, despite the fuses having a clean bill of health just months earlier. But this was not the most devastating news. Morris told the family that no human remains had been found on site, implying that the flames had been hot enough to completely burn away their bodies. Morris suggested that George take ashes from the site and bury them in a box in place of the bodies of his 5 lost children. Intending to memorialize the site with a garden, and perhaps out of grief, George covered the site of the fire with 5 feet of dirt a mere 4 days later. Death certificates were issued just after the new year, despite their there being no remains to examine. The certificates ruled the cause of death had been from suffocation or from fire that destroyed their home while they slept. And as time went on, questions over the thoroughness of the investigation were only a small facet of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the Sodder house fire. George and Jennie Sodder, filled with grief from their loss, were not so blinded by it that they did not notice some of the facts concerning the fire itself did not line up with investigators' conclusions. For instance, why had it taken the fire department over 6 hours to respond? NPR radio conducted an interview with retired fire chiefs Roy and Steve Cruikshank, father and son, who were working in a neighboring area at the time. They claimed the Fayetteville Fire Department did not even have a siren on their apparatus at the time. What made it worse was the holiday. No one was manning the fire station since it was volunteer-based, and operators weren't answering either. West Virginia State Fire Marshal Sterling Lewis also stated in an interview that in 1945, Fayetteville firefighters did not have self-contained breathing apparatuses, making it impossible to avoid smoke inhalation and dangerous to enter a house already consumed by flames. But Sterling thinks it was a mistake on Morris's part not to respond until the morning. But why, as reported by Fire Chief Morris, were there no human remains found? The Sodders said the home was leveled in 30 to 45 minutes, the rapidity possibly due to a stiff wind blowing that night. However, the ruins continued to burn and smolder until the fire department's arrival at 8 a.m. So how, in under an hour, were the flames able to destroy any trace of human remains? This was the question that plagued Jennie Sodder the most. An employee at the local crematorium told Jennie that even after 2 to 3 hours of temperatures ranging from 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that bones still remain. An average house fire burns at 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, nowhere near hot enough to completely destroy any trace of human remains. There were even household appliances found in the basement, burned, yes, but still partially intact and identifiable. Jennie even conducted her own experiments burning the bones of chickens, cows, and pigs, but she was always left with charred but identifiable remains. The fire didn't last long enough or reach temperatures hot enough to destroy the bodies of 5 children. But was the fire truly the result of faulty wiring or foul play? Not long after the fire, a local bus driver came forward and claimed he'd witnessed balls of fire being tossed onto the Sodders' roof around the time the house caught fire. After the fire, Jennie Sodder happened upon a curious object she later described as a green pineapple lying in the yard where her home once stood. Jennie turned the object over to investigators, and Army personnel were able to conclude the object was an incendiary device. Jennie was positive the fire was a result of foul play. She recalled the flames had spread from the top floor to the ground. However, this would contradict the ruling that the fire began at the fuse box, which was located on the ground floor. Fire Marshal Lewis said the flames still could have come from the fuse box and burned the top floor first. In a phenomenon known as chimney fire, flames sometimes pass up through the walls, jumping from one floor to the next without burning outward. But strange phenomenon aside, if the bus driver had truly seen fire being hurled at the Sodders' rooftop, who had been throwing the incendiary devices? And what of the letter George always kept against the house? Another witness came forward and was able to shed some light on at least one of those mysteries. The witness said he saw 2 men at the Sodders' home that evening. They were in the process of stealing block and tackle equipment George used for his business to remove car engines. He knew exactly who they were, too. Dave Adkins and Lonnie Johnson, the owners of a beer joint not far from the Sodders' home. Unfortunately, only Lonnie Johnson was questioned as Dave Adkins joined the Army to avoid persecution, but Lonnie's testimony did not give the Sodders the closure they had been hoping for. At the coroner's inquest, Lonnie testified that he had cut the phone line with pliers, having mistaken them for power lines. But the bigger question here was, how had he cut the phone lines when they were 14 feet above the ground? Was it possible he had seen George's ladder propped up against the house and decided to use it himself to cut what he thought was the electricity? Lonnie pled guilty to a stealing charge and paid a $25 fee for his crimes. He confessed nothing about throwing incendiary devices onto the roof, But officials admitted that neither Lonnie Johnson nor George's former employer, Fiorenzo Genutolo, were investigated as thoroughly as they should have been. Still, even having pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the most haunting question for the family still remained. Why, after shouting desperately for Maurice, Martha, Jennie, Louis, and Betty for almost an hour, did the Sodders never once hear the children cry out? Fire Marshal Louis also offered some insight into this matter, saying if the flames originated above or near the children's room, it was entirely possible they were breathing in smoke long before the rest of the family, and succumbed to smoke inhalation in their sleep. But even if the children had woken up to see their bedroom alight with flame, they might not have cried out for help. Louis says that children under the age of 12 are panicked in a fire and don't think to get to a door or window to breathe. They will huddle away from the heat, barricading themselves into tight spaces. Louis said it wasn't uncommon to find the remains of children crouched in closets, under beds, or in empty bathtubs. But the Sodders were not satisfied with any official explanation and wanted to leave no stone unturned concerning the fate of their children. As they watched their home burn, the Sodders remembered lights still being on inside the house, so they were hard-pressed to buy the official ruling that the fire began due to faulty wiring. George demanded a second look at the fire site. So, nearly 4 years after the tragedy, crews once again sifted through what was left of the Sodders' old property. What they found was both strange and unsettling. Searchers discovered 4 small bones tucked in the corner of where the basement used to be. Dr. Oscar Hunter, the pathologist on scene that day, sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institute for identification, and not long after, they received their results. The bones were from a single set of 4 lumbar vertebrae with fused transverse recesses, meaning the bones belonged to someone 16 to 17 years of age. The oldest missing Sodder child was Maurice, 14 at the time of the fire. Pathologists said it was not impossible, but highly improbable for his vertebrae to show the maturation of an older adolescent. There was something George had noticed immediately upon finding the bones, though, and something the Smithsonian Institute noticed as well. The vertebrae had no evidence of charring or burning and had never been exposed to fire. During the second excavation, they were the only bones found, and pathologists would have expected to find the rest of the skeletons as well. The Institute concluded that the bones likely came from the supply of dirt George used to cover the site of the fire just days after, though it was also possible in the time between investigations the remains were planted there by someone hoping to placate the Sodders' search for the truth. Following the report from the Smithsonian, there were 2 hearings in Charleston, West Virginia to reopen the case, but both Governor and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett said the case was hopeless and that it would remain closed. Fayette County Prosecutor J. Zane Summerfield said the case would only reopen if evidence of kidnapping came to light. There was nothing they could do, with the prosecutor adding, "Something is haunting this family, and I would do anything to put their minds at ease." George even attempted to contact the FBI in 1947, but received a reply from J. Edgar Hoover saying that he would be unable to help as the matter fell under local character. However, they would investigate if given permission by local authorities. But Fayetteville police and fire declined once again, citing a lack of evidence. But if they did not perish in the fire, and if no one saw them escaping the home, what happened to the Sodder siblings? George believed his children had been kidnapped just before the fire started, and that they were still alive. Those involved in the investigation were unconvinced of George's theory, thinking he was grief-driven and desperate for his children to be alive, but then the sightings started. A woman just outside of Fayetteville claimed she saw the 5 Sodder children peering out of the windows of a passing car the same night as the fire. Then, a waitress at a tourist stop located between Fayetteville and Charleston, West Virginia, said that she had served the children breakfast on Christmas morning and saw them leave in a car with Florida license plates. Every possible sighting led investigators to dead ends, but George never lost motivation and personally investigated each report. 4 to 5 weeks after the fire, an employee at a hotel in Charleston claimed to have checked the Sodder children into a hotel room. She said the children were traveling with 4 adults, 2 male and 2 female. The party arrived at the hotel around midnight, and the adults were speaking Italian to one another. When the clerk attempted to make small, friendly chat with the 5 children, the party went silent. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, they all left the next morning. Despite the reports, no witnesses were able to give credible evidence to corroborate their stories, but the sightings didn't stop. 1947, George sees a photograph of school children in a newspaper from New York and believes one of the girls in the photo is his youngest daughter, Betty, who would have been 7 at the time. George drove to Manhattan to search for her, but the girl's parents refused to make contact with him. Next, a woman staying at a convent in St. Louis claimed Martha was residing there, and there were several sightings in Florida where some believed the children were taken to live with a distant relative of Jennie's. The sighting furthest away came out of Davenport, California, where the sheriff received a mysterious letter implying that one of the Sodder children was attending school within the city, but no staff at any of the schools had any recollection of the Sodder children, either in name or appearance. All class photographs were checked, but revealed nothing. George sought out every sighting, but always returned home with a heavier heart and no answers. However, John Sodder theorized that if his siblings were still alive, they might have been taken to Italy, the place where George grew up. At first, the idea seemed far-fetched, until the Sodders received a postcard in 1968. The envelope was postmarked in Kentucky with no return address. It contained only a single photograph that showed a man with dark hair, possibly in his mid-20s. Then they discovered the message written on the back of the picture. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132 or 35. Jennie and George were immediately convinced the man in the picture was Louis. They could not deny the resemblance to their youngest son. The Sodders feared releasing the letter to the police might put their son in danger, so they hired a private detective to travel to Kentucky. They sent him to the location where the envelope had been postmarked to see if any more information could be gleaned from the letter. Unfortunately, the detective left for Kentucky with the Sodders' money and was never seen or heard from again. While Jennie and George had no idea what the message meant, some have speculated that the numbers on the back are zip codes that correspond to Palermo, Italy. Whether or not it was a cruel prank or an authentic photograph, the family was forced to grieve their loss all over again. George Sodder, even after years of heartbreak, remained steadfast in his conviction, though, saying, "Time is running out for us. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." Somewhere along the long, painful journey, the Sodder family lost faith in law enforcement and took the search into their own hands. George and Jennie erected a billboard along Route 16 pleading for help in finding out the truth of what happened that night. They passed out flyers offering a $10,000 reward to anyone offering information that led to the recovery of their children. They hired C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator who uncovered new evidence concerning the very first investigation of the fire on Christmas morning. The state fire marshal present at the excavation interviewed everyone that helped sort through the charred ruins, all of whom reported seeing human remains on the site. Why was it then that Morris told the Sodders that there were no remains found? West Virginia State Fire Marshal Sterling Lewis said he believes the remains could have been overlooked as the investigation was carried out by volunteers and only lasted 2 hours. A normal excavation of a house fire can take anywhere from days to weeks to complete thoroughly. Sterling believes that a small amount of remains were found that day. When searching for human remnants in the fire, investigators look specifically for internal organs and entrails, which turn a bright shade of red and are easily spotted amongst the gray and black cinders. The fire marshal put Fire Chief Morris in charge of the remains and in charge of informing the family. But Morris's original story that there had been no remains and witnesses and the fire marshal's stories did not line up. Why would Morris, in charge of the remains, not inform the family of the findings? A local minister came forward claiming Morris had confessed to him that he had in fact found a human heart on the scene and buried it in a box on the Sodders' property. Morris showed investigator Tinsley the spot where he'd buried the box, which law enforcement was able to dig up. There was an organ found inside, but after being tested, it was clear that it was not a human heart, but a beef liver, and that it had never been touched by fire. Once again, the Sodders had no answers. Rumors circulated that Morris buried the box and informed the minister of it in hopes that finding any sort of remnants would placate the family's search. However, Fire Marshal Sterling Lewis thinks Morris probably fabricated the entire story and buried the beef liver to cover up his own mistake in the handling of the remains. Lewis speculates Morris could have thrown away, lost, or left the remains at the scene, whether on accident or out of purposeful neglect. We will probably never know. What is known is that no one at the coroner's inquest was informed of the remains, and Morris could have concealed the box on scene at any time as the property was unguarded. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement and the Sodder family, they never found solid evidence that could lead to concrete answers and were only left with theories. Since the fire, the case has been widely speculated amongst private investigators and internet sleuths, and the theories of what really happened to the Sodder children stretch over a wide spectrum. The mystery not only haunted George Sodder for the rest of his life, but the legacy would follow his children and his grandchildren. Several of them believed a local mafia attempted to recruit George into the circle, but failed to convince him. In revenge, the men in the local mafia entered the Sodders' home on Christmas Eve and kidnapped the children from their beds, then in the process of driving away, set the house on fire behind them. Many of the Sodders believed the children lived out the rest of their lives and did not contact their family for fear of endangering them. However, law enforcement found this conclusion to be highly unlikely, claiming it would be extremely difficult for the children to be held against their will for such a long time. But FBI records pointed to another speculation. Many believed one of Jennie's brothers had kidnapped the children and taken them to Florida, but the police thoroughly investigated this lead. Jennie's relatives were forced to prove their genetic relation to their own children and were able to do so. Another possibility postulated by the internet sleuthing and crime-solving communities is that the children were kidnapped when they went outside to finish their chores before the fire even started. The last living member of the family, Sylvia Sodder, is adamant that her siblings did not die in the blaze. She said that while she was only 2 when the tragedy took place, the fire was her first memory, and that she would never forget the sight of her father bleeding and screaming, or the terrible symphony of crying, and so many years later the echoes never having any resolution, continuing on and on forever. George Sodder died in 1968. Afterwards, Jennie built a fence around her new home and continually added rooms, effectively distancing herself further and further from the outside. Since the fire, she donned only black clothing until her death in 1989. The Sodders' billboard was taken down shortly after. And while there is a new property on the site of the fire, Jennie Sodder grew many flowers for years near the spot where the family had lost what was most precious to them. No matter what you choose to believe, please remember the Sodder family, generations past, and those still living are people who lost something great and whose legacy of death is not a sensation, but a curse and a sadness among them and those closest to them. They lost, just as we all have in some ways, and we may never truly know what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. And remember, these may be dark matters, but the darkness always matters. That's the end of the video. What do you believe happened to the Sodder children? I encourage discussions in the comment section, but please remember to be respectful and mindful with your words. If you would like to see more videos from me, don't forget to subscribe. Next video will be a little more lighthearted, but you definitely don't want to miss it. If you saw my last video and left a comment with your scary experience, there is a chance I will read yours in my next video so we can share the creepy stories among everyone. So stay tuned for that. I will see you lovelies in the next video. Have a good night.